Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 3 in my series of weird histories on what was originally epidemics, but it turns out that this video is actually going to be about an endemic disease, that is, malaria. So what's the difference between an epidemic and an endemic disease? Well, basically an epidemic is when a disease breaks out and begins to spread rapidly over an area. So oftentimes when we talk about epidemics or pandemics, we're talking about the emergence of new diseases in an area that we're attempting to contain. An endemic disease, on the other hand, is a disease that simply sticks around in an area and exists within a given population. Malaria is one such disease. As you're going to see, malaria has actually been with humanity since the beginning of Homo sapiens as a species, and it is with us still. So this video, while about disease or a plague, is about an endemic rather than an epidemic disease. And in this video, I'm going to be arguing that malaria has actually shaped a number of important major historical patterns that helps to explain why the modern world is the way it is. So let's start by just looking at some basic facts about malaria. So malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. The actual malaria germ is a single-celled eukaryotic organism known as a plasmodium. And this organism, this plasmodium, lives for part of its life cycle inside mosquitoes and for part of its life cycle inside the human body. It is transmitted when a mosquito with the plasmodium bites a person. This then injects the plasmodium into the bloodstream. The plasmodium then swims through our bloodstream into the liver, where it then goes dormant for a period of time. After a certain period of time, it will then spread from the human liver into the human bloodstream and will begin to infest human red blood cells. At a certain stage, the plasmodia will then break out from all of the different red blood cells and begin swimming freely around in our bloodstream again. So, and this is actually when the major symptoms of malaria manifest. As our blood cells start to bust open, people come down with major fevers, along with lots of other stuff, shaking, headaches, all sorts of terrible stuff. And the plasmodium is then swimming around freely again in your bloodstream. It's at this point that if a mosquito bites you, that mosquito can then pick up the plasmodium and then carry it to a new host. So this plasmodium has been around with human beings for forever and has been transferring itself back and forth between the bloodstreams and livers of humans and the guts of mosquitoes for hundreds of thousands of years, probably. So that's what malaria is. The main symptom is an acute and recurring fever. So after you get bit by a malaria bug, it'll probably be like a week or possibly a couple weeks, sometimes even longer, before you get your first real symptoms. But then you will come down with a major fever and basically collapse and be useless for a while. And if left untreated, this fever will continue to come back months and even sometimes years later. The disease isn't super deadly. If you're a healthy adult, you're pretty likely to survive these fevers, though of course major complications can arise. This can damage your organs, and in severe cases and among old people and children, it can frequently result in death. Malaria is still with us. In 2018, which is the most recent year I could find data on, there were 228 million cases of malaria in the world, mostly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast and Southern Asia. And out of these cases, there were 400,000 deaths. And if you think about it, that's actually a very low death rate of less than 1%. So while malaria is not an incredibly deadly virus, the extent to which it has spread and the major health impacts of this disease make it a serious problem. And even if you don't die from malaria, it can ruin your life and reduce your productivity. And some studies have even suggested it can reduce your mental functioning permanently if you are exposed to this disease. Now, let's look at malaria and its impact on early civilizations. So most people who've studied malaria suggest that malaria actually co-evolved with humanity during our time as we were evolving in Africa. And the very complex relationship that malaria has with the human body, and the fact that malaria doesn't kill us outright, but rather just kind of lives in us, which is gross, suggests that malaria has been with us for a very, very long time. However, with the rise of agriculture, malaria goes from kind of a minor annoyance to hunter-gatherer groups to a major problem because agriculture basically creates mosquito heaven. Think about what you're doing when you're engaging in large-scale agriculture. You're basically destroying the natural ecosystem. You're eradicating most of the food chain and replacing that food chain with well-watered fields and lots of people. So there are now way fewer mosquito-eating animals. There's lots of standing water sitting around as you irrigate your fields. And there's lots and lots of people packed close together. And this allows for a vast multiplication of the number of mosquitoes and a vast multiplication in the rate of transmission of malaria from one person to another person because the disease is just more tightly packed. There's lots of evidence that malaria was a serious problem in the ancient world. There's genetic evidence from remains of people from ancient Egypt that malaria was a major problem for them. The Romans seem to have described the disease fairly accurately, and their term for it was swamp fever. Now, of course, mosquitoes breed heavily in swamps because of all of the stagnant water, so it's clear that the Romans were kind of groping in the right direction, understanding that there was some connection between swamps and this fever that you would get. They didn't notice that it was the mosquitoes, though. The actual word malaria is Italian, and it comes from the words in Italian for bad air. And the Italians also associated it with the kind of stink of decay that comes from swamps and stuff like that. Yeah, so here's an image of an agricultural field with little irrigation furrows here, so ideal breeding spots for mosquitoes. And here are some 30,000-year-old mosquitoes preserved in amber that have actually been tested and shown to contain the Malaria plasmodium. So we know that malaria has been around with us for a very long time. Now, while agriculture and malaria went together pretty much everywhere, the place where malaria reached its sort of greatest intensity in the pre-modern world was Western Africa. So if you look at this map here, this is a map of deaths due to malaria today. But actually, this area of sub-Saharan Western Africa was probably the main spot for malaria deaths for most of human history, or at least most of, agricultural history. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, Africa is a tropical environment, so mosquitoes can breed like crazy. Also, this is where malaria originally evolved, so there was probably greater genetic diversity among the mosquito populations there. And with the rise of slash and burn agriculture in Western Africa, where you go in and you basically destroy and burn part of a rainforest and then farm in that spot, this created, like with most other types of agriculture, really good conditions for mosquitoes to breed. And so the mosquitoes within Africa became particularly specialized in feeding on human blood. There's a number of mosquito species known as Anopheles gambii that feed preferentially on human blood among all else and are particularly bad about carrying the malaria parasite. And in these West African farming communities, malaria became, according to some scientists' estimates, basically 100% prevalent. Basically, everybody who lived in these farming communities got malaria and was exposed to it repeatedly throughout their life. And this placed such heavy selective pressure on humans that we actually see the emergence of genetic microevolution to resist the malaria parasite. And there are a couple different genetic shifts that have been documented. One is the sickle cell trait, which is probably the most well known, which is a recessive gene where if you just have one of the genes, it actually makes you largely immune to malaria without having many downsides. However, if you have two copies of that recessive gene, then you get sickle cell anemia, which is really bad for you. Another evolutionary adaptation that we see in this area is a whole kind of like genre of mutations in the way that our body creates hemoglobin. And this is called thalassemias. I read about it, I really don't understand it very technically, but what I do understand is that both of these are examples of genetic adaptations of people in malaria-prone regions that make them largely immune, or at least far more resistant to the negative effects of malaria. Now, there are major costs to these adaptations. There's a reason that our blood cells are the way that they are, and changing the way our blood cells work comes with costs. However, so like sickle cell anemia greatly reduces the life expectancy of a child born with two copies of that recessive gene. But this just shows how dangerous and prevalent malaria was if genetic selection was able to pick these traits, even in spite of the fact that they have major costs on the people, on people who have them. So anyway, long and short of it is, malaria is so brutally prevalent in Western Africa that there's actually some genetic evolution that takes place in order to immunize the population against this disease. This is going to be very important later on in our story. Actually, right now. So around 1450, people from Northern and Western Europe, England, France, Portugal, Spain, begin exploring and attempting to colonize different parts of the world. And so there are expeditions around Africa, into India and Southeast Asia, and also to the Americas. And the patterns of European colonization are going to be greatly affected by the presence of malaria, along with other tropical diseases. Basically, these white guys from the north have not been exposed to malaria, and there has been no selection pressure within these populations to be resistant to malaria. So when these guys show up in the swamps of eastern North Carolina or Louisiana or the Amazon rainforest and get swarmed by mosquitoes, they die like flies. The death rates for white people in malaria-prone tropical regions are incredibly high. And what this means is that it basically slows, and in some cases entirely prevents, European colonization in tropical and subtropical regions. There is some debate about the origin of malaria in the New World. Some people suggest that malaria was already endemic, but it seems hard to understand how that could have happened, given the migration patterns of people through like Russia and Siberia. Like, it seems hard to imagine that malaria could have survived that migration. So a lot of people suggest that Europeans actually brought malaria to the New World and then immediately started dying from it. I'm not sure. I don't think there's a definitive answer here yet. But anyway, so this is the region of the United States in which malaria was prevalent up until like 1950. And then if you look at this map here, you'll see that Portuguese developments were limited basically just to the coast. And any attempt to enter into the deep rainforest was basically immediately stopped because of disease. Also, you'll notice that the Spanish colonies largely limit themselves to the Andes Mountains. And that is because once you get above a certain elevation, the malaria-causing mosquitoes no longer cause any problems. And that's why Spanish cities in South America tend to be at fairly high elevations. Like, for example, Quito, Ecuador is up at 9,000 feet, or Bogota is also at a very high elevation. I don't know exactly how high. On top of this, it helps to explain economic developments in the United States that will eventually lead to slavery and the Civil War. In the northern colonies, starting around like Maryland and Pennsylvania, malaria is not present. And this means that white settlers have a much lower death rate and a much higher birth rate than white settlers in the South. And so the North is largely able to populate itself and provide adequate labor supplies for itself with white laborers coming in from England and other parts of Europe. In the South, though, white immigrants tend to have a very high death rate. And this starts with Jamestown, where like more than half of the original settlers die right away, and continues on throughout the 16 and 1700s. And as agriculture and plantation agriculture becomes more important, the South becomes more and more dependent on farm workers. However, the death rates among white farm workers are so extreme that the South turns to slave labor from West Africa. And one of the main reasons why black slaves were particularly useful in the southern United States and also in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil was that they had partial genetic resistance to malaria. So they had a much lower death rate, their children were much more likely to survive and be healthy, and so this gave them a serious competitive advantage over white farmers, and also helps to explain how large plantations of black slaves were able to outcompete small farms run by independent white farmers in the American South. So malaria, by and large, helps to explain why slavery became a major system in the Americas. That being said, it is important to recognize that the death rates among slaves were still brutal, especially in in Brazil and the Caribbean. The death rates were so high that the slave population there never became self-sustaining. And that's why about 90% of all the slaves brought across in the Atlantic slave trade actually end up going to the Caribbean and Brazil, is because the death rates are so high that you have to continually bring in fresh people to keep the labor systems going. So anyway, malaria largely helps to explain patterns of slavery in the New World. Crazy, whoa, huh? Now, something interesting is that malaria resistance, while it's one of the main reasons why black people are being enslaved and brought to the New World in the first place, it also provides a major advantage to black people in the Americas who are attempting to resist slavery. And that is because large parts of the Americas are so swampy and mosquito infested that white people simply die if they go there. So like anywhere that is swampy or jungly is very, very dangerous for white armies or white law enforcement officers to go into. And this allows for the formation of a number of very successful independent communities of escaped slaves. So in Brazil, where a lot of the slaves went to work on sugar plantations, it was pretty easy just to run away into the Amazon rainforest. And as this continued over hundreds of years, a number of independent, autonomous communities grew up that were a mix of Native American populations and escaped West African populations. And a number of communities grew up. The most notable one, though, was basically like a city in the middle of the Amazon rainforest called Palmares that had a population of over 10,000 people for a while before it was finally located and destroyed by the Portuguese. In Jamaica, which was also a major hub for sugar and the slave trade, a number of escaped slaves went away into the interior of Jamaica and were able to set up an independent community there. And they were actually able to win a war against the British and force the British to sign a peace treaty in which they recognized the independence of the Maroons there in Jamaica. In North Carolina, on the North Carolina-Virginia border, there is a massive swamp known as the Great Dismal Swamp. And that was for over 100 years, was a location where escaped slaves could run away to. And the slaves actually developed a self-sustaining agricultural community in the middle of this swamp, which I'm sure was unpleasant. But the swamp was so dangerous that white slave catchers would not go into it. And if they did, they were likely to get very sick or they might just get shot. And probably most significantly, though, was in the French colony of Haiti. And so Haiti was a major sugar-producing island, but the amount of disease there was so brutal that almost no white people even lived on the island. More than 90% of the total population were black, and most of them were first-generation enslaved people from Africa. And in the late 1700s, partially as a result of the French Revolution, the population in Haiti rises up and kills the white landowners. And a series of armies are then sent to Haiti, and these armies, composed of white people, basically immediately get sick and start to die. And that, combined with skilled guerrilla warfare from the Haitians, results in the Haitians succeeding in winning their independence from France and becoming the second independent republic in the Americas following the United States. And so all of this shows how malaria played a really important role in limiting the power of European states to extend their control to new areas. And largely they were limited to very small amounts of control in tropical and subtropical regions until certain advances in medicine make that possible. And a really good case study for this is the European conquest of Africa. So Africa for a long time had a lot of different names that Europeans called it. But one of its nicknames was the white man's grave. And basically, if you were a soldier or a sailor, and you were sent down to Africa, and you stayed in Africa for a couple years, your life expectancy was super short. The odds that you would get some kind of tropical disease, probably malaria, but also like yellow fever or any other number of terrible diseases, you would just drop dead. Soldiers who were posted at forts basically viewed this as a punishment and knew that they had a pretty small chance of actually making it back to wherever they went. So European colonies in Africa up until the 1850s remained very limited. There were a few small coastal trading settlements like here, the Portuguese on the coast of Angola. And South Africa was a little different because it's more temperate and malaria is not as bad. But basically, the interior of Africa remained controlled by African societies, either small states or decentralized farming communities. Europeans couldn't conquer Africa because of a massive disease barrier, along with other obstacles, like lots of people who don't want to be conquered. However, around 1850, this changes. And that is because the active ingredient of quinine is discovered. There's this particular bark from this type of plant called the cinchona plant. In 1850, the active ingredient of quinine is isolated from the cinchona plant, and it starts to be produced as a medicine. And this medicine, known as quinine, gives people who take it substantial resistance to malaria. It's not 100% effective, but it's pretty effective. And this allows for Europeans to begin to explore and map and eventually to invade and conquer most of the African continent. And so it is this breakthrough in malaria medication that actually allows for the second largest continent in the world to be taken over in only a few decades. From 1850 to 1900, all of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, and Liberia, even though that's kind of controlled by the United States, is taken over by European countries. An interesting case study is Dr. David Livingstone, who was a medical doctor and a missionary, who basically just walked across large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And he did this for about 30 years. And he brought with him quinine tablets when he went. So this sort of wandering around the African interior for, 30 years would have been impossible before quinine, and it now was possible. However, Livingstone does ultimately end up dying from malaria. Like I said, quinine's not 100% effective. Another interesting case study, is the rise of gin and tonics as a popular alcoholic beverage. Tonic water contains quinine as one of its flavoring ingredients. However, a lot of people find the taste of quinine a little bit bitter and gross, and so the British East India Company began encouraging its employees to drink gin and tonics, where gin and lime juice would be added to cut the flavor of the quinine. And this served to give members of the British East India Company some degree of resistance to malaria. All right, we're going to look at one last case study. There's lots of other stuff we could talk about, but let's look at malaria and how it affected America in the 20th century. So in 1881, France attempted to build a canal through Panama. This attempt failed utterly, and the main reason for it was that super high rates of death among employees prevented them from being able to keep skilled, experienced workers on the job. Your life expectancy working on the canal was very low, and this was because of malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses. The French had no way of controlling these diseases because it had not yet been discovered that mosquitoes caused malaria. It's only in 1897 that mosquitoes are definitively proven to transmit malaria. And so, in 1904, when the United States decides to attempt a construction of a canal in Panama, they pair their efforts with a massive program of mosquito extermination. And among other things, they send out hundreds of people with tanks of oil and larvicide, and they basically just spray every single pool of standing water with chemicals to prevent mosquitoes from breeding. This drastic measure is effective. Mosquitoes are basically entirely exterminated, and mosquito-borne illnesses drop to around zero within the first couple years of U.S. efforts in Panama. This allows for the American workforce to build up and gain experience and begin making progress, and by 1914, the Panama Canal is completed. After World War II, the United States turns its malaria eradication technologies onto the homeland. In 1945, malaria was still endemic in the United States throughout the entire Southeast, from Virginia down to Louisiana. In order to change this, they undertake what is known as the National Malaria Eradication Program, in which the mass use of the pesticide DDT is used to eradicate mosquito populations. It's sprayed on people's houses, it's sprayed all over wetlands, and on top of that, a lot of wetlands are simply destroyed. That is, the water is drained out, and this is to limit the places where mosquitoes can breed. This program is effective, and within 4 years, the malaria mosquitoes are eradicated from the United States, and malaria is now basically non-existent in the United States. Later attempts to do this sort of thing in other parts of the world are not as successful. And of course, the environmental impacts of spraying DDT everywhere and draining wetlands should be obvious. However, in spite of that, both the eradication of mosquitoes and effective control of malaria basically allow the United States to expand its sphere of influence throughout the entirety of the Americas, both into the American South, which for a long time had resisted economic integration into the North, and Latin America, which for a long time exercised some degree of independence from the United States. By the mid-20th century, the United States is basically able to control the entire Western Hemisphere, either directly or indirectly. And the eradication of the malaria was crucial in making this happen. That plus air conditioning basically is what has made the South one of the fastest growing regions in the United States since 1950. So anyway, that's some stuff. There's definitely more stuff we could talk about with malaria, including the ongoing problems with malaria in the developing world today. But I'll leave you with some reflections. So first of all, it's interesting to think about disease and state control. So a lot of civilizations and states have basically met their limits, not because of outside forces, but because of disease. And I think malaria provides a really interesting case study of that. Malaria prevents, to a certain extent, states from doing what they want. So how does that work? Why are governments? Yeah, anyway. Second, how would the world look if malaria didn't exist? Would Europeans simply have conquered Africa back in 1500? Or alternatively, if malaria hadn't existed, would Africa have been able to build up dense populations of using irrigated agriculture? Maybe Africa would have built up massive empires and possibly moved north and conquered the Mediterranean and the Middle East. There's no telling how different the world would be if patterns of disease had been significantly different. And last of all, then this is a much broader question, but how much is humanity actually in control? We like to think in history about like, political events and leaders and technological developments as kind of shaping our history. But when you look at how much malaria has impacted the development of the modern world, it makes you pause for a second. And that so much of modern history was actually shaped by a disease that we didn't even understand. Um, and so, like, how much are we really in control, or how much is of what is happening is just kind of random chance or fate? I don't know. Think about it. Anyway, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, here are some books that you should read. This is where I got a lot of my anecdotes and information, along with a bunch of random websites. Um, so anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and stay healthy, folks. Wear bug spray.